Microsoft, he wrote, had to thrive in a mobile-first, cloud-first world. That sentence sounded like strategy. It was also a transfer of gravity. The center of Microsoft would no longer be the boxed operating system on a desk. It would become the service running behind everything. A month later, Nadella stood before reporters and repeated the phrase, "The future would be connected devices feeding connected cloud platforms." What followed was not the disappearance of Windows. It was something subtler. Windows stopped being the unquestioned center of Microsoft. The old image of one visionary deciding the future from Redmond became less useful for explaining how the company actually moved. The new Microsoft was being governed by a machine of boards, metrics, cloud contracts, security obligations, investors, and recurring revenue. That machine does not issue cinematic commands to engineers. It creates incentives, limits, targets, and defaults that are harder to see. And when those pressures reach the operating system, users experience them as account prompts, telemetry, updates, services, and integration. The mystery is not whether Bill Gates secretly still runs Microsoft. Public records make that idea increasingly difficult to sustain. The real question is why so many controversial Windows decisions continue even when power users complain loudly and repeatedly. To answer that, you have to stop looking for a single mastermind and examine the corporate architecture that replaced one. Bill Gates remains one of the most recognizable faces in technology, but recognition is not the same thing as corporate control. By 2014, when Nadella became chief executive, Gates had already moved away from the day-to-day operational role that defined Microsoft's early decades. In March 2020, Microsoft announced that Gates was leaving its board, while continuing at the time as a technology advisor to Nadella and other leaders. That matters because boards, not legends, hold formal governance power over public corporations, and Microsoft's board had become structurally independent. That matters because boards, not legends, hold formal governance power over public corporations, and Microsoft's board had become structurally independent. The company's 2020 proxy statement listed 12 director nominees, 11 of them independent. Nadella was the only management insider among them. There was also a cultural reason this model could take hold. Microsoft spent decades organizing itself around product kingdoms, each defending its own platform and revenue. Nadella's transformation pushed the opposite idea. Shared cloud infrastructure, common identity, cross-platform services, and business units that could reinforce one another instead of treating Windows as the automatic winner of every internal argument. That shift helps explain why Microsoft became more willing to put major software on rival platforms while making its own ecosystem more service-oriented. The strategic asset was no longer simply Windows exclusivity. It was the customer relationship, the subscription, the account, the developer workflow, the data estate, and the cloud consumption that could persist regardless of which screen the customer used. This is a more resilient business model, but it changes the meaning of platform power. Under the old logic, Microsoft defended Windows because Windows was the moat. Under the new logic, Microsoft can afford to be cross-platform precisely because identity, cloud, productivity, security, developer tooling, and AI create multiple overlapping moats. That is why cloud first should not be understood as a slogan about servers. It was a redesign of corporate dependence. The company reduced the strategic risk of losing any single device category by building services that could follow customers across devices while still making Windows valuable as a privileged endpoint. The result is a corporation that can tolerate some decline in the relative importance of traditional Windows licensing while continuing to deepen its relationship with the same user through subscriptions and cloud services. That is a far more durable form of control than relying on one operating system upgrade cycle. He also held the titles of chairman and chief executive, giving him enormous influence, but Microsoft paired that role with a lead independent director and committees responsible for audit, governance, compensation, and risk. This is the first layer of the modern power structure. Not a founder monarch, but a governance system designed to supervise management while aligning it with long-term corporate performance. That system is not abstract. It reaches directly into the way Microsoft pays its most powerful executives. In fiscal 2025, Microsoft said more than 95% of Nadella's annual target compensation opportunity was performance-based. His equity compensation was delivered through performance stock awards rather than ordinary time-based stock grants. Those awards were tied to long-term value creation, strategic operating metrics, and a modifier based on Microsoft's total shareholder return relative to the S&P 500. That does not mean Nadella wakes up and asks how many telemetry events Windows should send before breakfast. It means his incentives are mathematically tied to growth, profitability, strategic execution, and shareholder value. The difference is crucial. Corporate power often works through measurement before it works through direct orders. If recurring cloud revenue rises, if enterprise contracts deepen, if subscriptions expand, if infrastructure utilization grows, if margins hold, the system rewards the leaders who produce those outcomes. and the scale of that reward system mirrors a much larger transformation in Microsoft's revenue base. By fiscal 2026, Microsoft reported annual revenue of roughly $331.8 billion. Microsoft Cloud exceeded $214 billion, while Azure revenue surpassed $100 billion for the first time. Azure had grown from a strategic bet into one of the central economic engines of the company. In fiscal 2026, Microsoft said Azure revenue increased 41%. That is the second layer of the power structure, the economics of the cloud. A licensed operating system is valuable when a customer buys a machine or pays for an upgrade. A cloud platform can generate revenue repeatedly, continuously, and across an entire organization. Storage, identity databases, security, collaboration, AI, application hosting, analytics, and management can all become metered or subscribed services. Once that economic model dominates, the strategic question changes. The company is no longer optimizing only for the quality of a local software product. It is optimizing for an ecosystem in which users, businesses, developers, devices, data, and workloads remain connected to services Microsoft can secure, manage, measure, and monetize over time. Windows fits naturally into that architecture because it sits at the endpoint where identity, applications, search, security, cloud storage, device management, and user behavior meet. The operating system becomes more than software that launches programs. It becomes the gateway to a commercial stack. This is where criticism of modern Windows often becomes emotionally charged. To a power user, a local computer feels like privately controlled territory. To a cloud company, that same computer can also be a managed endpoint inside a larger service environment. Those two ideas are not automatically incompatible. Centralized security can stop malware. Cloud identity can simplify administration. Telemetry can expose crashes that affect millions of machines. But the balance of power changes when the vendor decides which parts of that connection are optional, which are required, and how long the user can resist changes. Microsoft's own Windows privacy documentation makes the distinction explicit. Windows supports required diagnostic data and optional diagnostic data. Optional diagnostic data can be disabled. Required diagnostic data is sent because Microsoft says it needs that information to keep Windows secure, reliable, compatible, and serviceable. Separate from diagnostic data, Microsoft also documents required service data for connected experiences and cloud-backed functions. This is important because the word telemetry is often used as if it describes a single hidden surveillance pipe. In reality, Microsoft documents multiple categories, purposes, controls, and service dependencies. That does not eliminate privacy concerns. It clarifies where the real policy dispute lies. The dispute is not whether any technical diagnostics should exist. Modern operating systems at global scale need some way to detect crashes, hardware incompatibilities, security failures, and update problems. The more serious question is who defines the minimum necessary data, how transparent those definitions are, and whether a user can operate the product with a meaningfully different privacy posture. For enterprise customers, Microsoft provides extensive controls through policy, management tools, and specialized editions. For ordinary consumers, the choices are narrower. That asymmetry reveals another force inside the company, enterprise economics. Microsoft's most profitable relationships are not simply one person buying one Windows license. They are organizations buying combinations of Azure, Microsoft 365, security, identity, database, developer, management, and AI services. An enterprise wants thousands of devices patched, compliant, auditable, and recoverable. A system administrator may value standardization more than local experimentation. A power user may want exactly the opposite: the ability to freeze a configuration, disable a service permanently, run without an account, and decide personally when the machine changes. Microsoft has to serve both groups, but the group delivering vast recurring contracts has disproportionate influence on what good product behavior looks like inside a cloud-first company. That influence does not require a secret meeting. It can emerge from support costs, security incidents, renewal rates, compliance obligations, deployment success, and customer retention. The same logic helps explain the Windows update model. Windows 11 uses an annual feature update cadence with monthly cumulative security updates. Microsoft publishes defined support windows for each release. For mainstream Home and Pro editions, feature releases generally receive 24 months of support. Enterprise and education releases receive longer servicing periods. Microsoft also says Windows updates download and install automatically in normal consumer configurations, although users can pause them temporarily and manage restart timing. That is not the same as saying Microsoft can replace anything on every machine at any moment. Managed business devices have policy controls, and deployment can be staged, but the direction is clear. Windows is treated as a continuously serviced platform, not as a finished artifact that remains untouched until its owner chooses to upgrade. The security rationale is strong. An unpatched operating system connected to modern networks is a liability not only to its owner, but potentially to everyone it can attack. Yet continuous servicing also shifts authority. The vendor controls the release train, the support clock, the compatibility baseline, and increasingly the moment when older configurations stop receiving protection. For a user who remembers installing Windows from a disk and keeping the same setup for years, that feels like a philosophical break. For Microsoft's current business model, it is almost inevitable. Cloud services depend on predictable clients, security teams depend on known baselines, enterprise administrators depend on supported versions, developers depend on common APIs. The more Microsoft sells an integrated platform, the more expensive uncontrolled fragmentation becomes. This is why it is misleading to describe every controversial Windows decision as a personal preference of Satya Nadella. Nadella is extraordinarily powerful inside Microsoft. He is chairman, chief executive, the public strategist, and the leader most associated with the cloud and AI transformation. But his power operates inside a network that evaluates him through financial performance, strategic metrics, board oversight, investor expectations, regulatory exposure, security outcomes, and customer demand. The investors are another misunderstood piece of this network. Microsoft's 2025 proxy identified Vanguard and BlackRock as its only shareholders above the 5% disclosure threshold, with holdings of roughly 8.95% and 7.30% respectively. Those numbers are enormous, but they do not mean two asset management firms sit in Redmond choosing start menu layouts. Much of their ownership reflects shares held through index funds and other investment products on behalf of millions of underlying investors. Their leverage is real at the governance level. Voting, stewardship, director elections, executive compensation, and conversations with company leadership. Microsoft's own proxy says its lead independent director, compensation committee chair, investor relations team, Nadella, and CFO Amy Hood engage with large institutional shareholders on governance and compensation topics. That is very different from direct product micromanagement. The influence is upstream. Institutional investors care about durable returns, capital allocation, risk, management quality, and strategic execution. They create pressure for a company to prove that its enormous investments produce economic results. In the cloud era, those results are measured in consumption, subscriptions, seats, remaining performance obligations, margins, retention, and growth. In the AI era, the pressure has become even more intense because the infrastructure is staggeringly expensive. The size of Microsoft's infrastructure spending makes that pressure visible in physical form. In the quarter ending June 30th, 2026, CFO Amy Hood said capital expenditures reached $41 billion, with roughly two-thirds directed towards shorter-lived assets such as CPUs and GPUs. The company also reported adding 31 new data centers across 5 continents in that quarter, bringing the fiscal year total to 88, while adding another gigawatt of capacity. These are not the spending patterns of a software publisher whose primary concern is selling a desktop license once every few years. Every new facility has to be filled with profitable workloads. Every accelerator has to serve customers. Every network and power commitment creates pressure to convert infrastructure into usage, contracts, subscriptions, and durable demand. That is why financial language and product language increasingly merge. Microsoft talks about seats, consumption, utilization, remaining performance obligations, cost per outcome, and efficiency across the same stack where users encounter Copilot, Azure, Microsoft 365, GitHub, security tools, and Windows. In the same fiscal year, the company said commercial remaining performance obligations had reached hundreds of billions of dollars. That figure represents contracted business not yet recognized as revenue, and it turns future customer relationships into a financial asset management expects to fulfill over years. This kind of backlog changes corporate behavior. A company with enormous multi-year commitments must maintain reliability, capacity, compatibility, security, and customer confidence at industrial scale. That naturally favors standardized platforms, managed identities, predictable servicing, and integrated administration. There is also a direct shareholder loop. In fiscal 2026's fourth quarter alone, Microsoft returned more than $10 billion through dividends and share repurchases, and more than $43 billion over the full year. The company, therefore, has to fund infrastructure growth while continuing to demonstrate returns to owners. That tension matters. Microsoft is simultaneously pouring capital into future computing and proving that the investment can produce current cash flow. Product integration becomes one route for making those economics work. The more surfaces that can distribute cloud and AI services, the more opportunities exist to monetize infrastructure already built. Windows is strategically useful in this equation because it reaches the moment when a person begins work. The The desktop can expose identity, search, storage, security, AI assistance, browser services, enterprise policies, and subscriptions before a competing service ever enters the workflow. In July 2026, Nadella told investors Microsoft was investing in Windows fundamentals and quality while also trying to make Windows a preferred place for secure edge AI. That phrase reveals how the operating system is now positioned, not merely as a destination, but as part of a hybrid architecture spanning local compute and cloud services. The local machine still matters. In fact, edge AI can move some inference onto the device, reducing latency and potentially limiting what must travel across networks. But even local intelligence can be governed by cloud identity, enterprise policy, model distribution, licensing, telemetry, and service integration. So the direction is not simply everything goes to Azure. It is more sophisticated. Microsoft wants the endpoint and the cloud to reinforce each other, allowing workloads to run where economics, security, regulation, latency, and customer requirements make the most sense. That makes the sovereignty debate harder, because a user can gain more local capability while simultaneously becoming more dependent on a vendor's identity, update, policy, and service layers. Power can decentralize technically while centralizing institutionally. Data centers, accelerators, networking, power, cooling, model training, inference, and software integration require capital at a scale that turns technical architecture into a balance sheet decision. Microsoft cannot treat AI integration as a side experiment when it is spending heavily to make cloud infrastructure the substrate for future computing. That is why Copilot, Azure AI, Microsoft 365, GitHub, security products, browsers, search, and Windows increasingly appear as parts of one economic flywheel. The flywheel is simple in concept. Build infrastructure, attract workloads, integrate services, increase usage, collect signals, improve products, deepen switching costs, and sell more services. Every component can be justified individually. Together, they produce an ecosystem that becomes harder to separate into independent products. This is the mechanism behind what many users describe as loss of digital sovereignty. Digital sovereignty, in this context, is not a legal term. It is the practical ability of a user or organization to control identity, data, software, update timing, hardware, interoperability, and exit options. A system can be secure, useful, and popular while still reducing some forms of that autonomy. The tension becomes clearest when Microsoft introduces a feature that benefits from cloud identity or data and presents it inside Windows by default. From the company's perspective, integration reduces friction and exposes customers to capabilities they already pay for or may choose to buy. From the user's perspective, the operating system starts behaving like distribution space for the vendor's broader commercial strategy. Both interpretations can be true at the same time. The mistake is assuming that one executive must personally desire every prompt, recommendation, account requirement, or service integration. Large companies produce policy through layers. Product teams chase engagement and quality goals. Security teams push patching and identity controls. Finance pushes efficiency and returns. Sales teams push enterprise adoption. Legal teams manage regulatory exposure. Cloud teams push usage. AI teams push distribution. The board pushes durable performance. Investors judge the result. When all of those vectors point toward a more connected, measurable, continuously serviced platform, local autonomy loses by accumulation rather than decree. This is why the phrase telemetry-driven monetization needs care. Diagnostic data can support product reliability and security. Search activity can support advertising. Cloud usage can support billing. Product interaction data can support design decisions. These are different mechanisms. Lumping them together as one surveillance system hides the more interesting truth. Modern Microsoft has multiple